It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Professor Elias Kingsley stood at the front of his lecture hall, poised to deliver his usual sharp-witted tirade on history. The sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows on the old wooden floors, and the murmur of students settling into their seats created a familiar hum in the air. But something was different that day, something charged, something unsettling. The lecture hall was packed, as it often was for Kingsley's lectures on philosophy, religion, and the historical impact of figures like Jesus Christ. He had long held a reputation for being provocative. His teachings often leaned toward controversial interpretations, shaking the foundations of conventional beliefs. But as he adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began speaking, an unusual tension filled the room. This time, he wasn't just teasing or questioning. He was on the edge of something far riskier. Why do we still revere this man? Kingsley began, glancing at the students with a sly grin. Jesus Christ, the so-called Son of God, the central figure of Christianity. A carpenter, a preacher, but also a symbol of suffering and sacrifice. And yet, isn't it curious that we still treat him as some infallible deity? As if his teachings should still govern our modern lives? He paused for dramatic effect, letting his words sink into the room like a stone thrown into a still pond. The students shifted in their seats. A few exchanged nervous glances, sensing the storm brewing. He continued, raising his voice just a little to emphasize the weight of his next words. Let's be real, Jesus was not a man of miracles. He was a product of his time, a political figure who wanted to upend the status quo and nothing more. The idea of his divinity is, at best, a convenient myth created by later followers. The room went quiet. A low murmur rippled through the crowd as a few students exchanged unsure looks. This was Kingsley's trademark, to challenge everything, to provoke doubt. But today, something felt different. There was an underlying hostility in the air. The tension was thick. Something was about to happen. And then, in the back of the lecture hall, a voice rang out clear, confident, and unmistakably defiant. You're wrong. It was a young man, dressed casually in a hoodie, his blonde hair tousled as he stood up in the middle of the room. The students turned, stunned by the interruption. It was Barron Trump. Kingsley's brow furrowed slightly, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the young man. This was the son of former President Donald Trump, an unexpected figure in a place like this. Barron was not known for public outbursts, and yet here he was, standing before the class with an air of quiet authority. You're wrong, Barron repeated, his voice calm but filled with an undeniable conviction. Jesus wasn't just a man, and his teachings were far more than political rhetoric. There's a depth to them that transcends history. And there's something you're missing, something powerful and real. Kingsley raised an eyebrow, intrigued. And what, pray tell, might that be? Barron stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. The room held its breath as the tension mounted, the students sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. The central conflict had begun. What was once a typical lecture, filled with Kingsley's confident deconstruction of faith, had now become the battleground for something much larger, a clash of ideologies, faith, and truth. The room was electric, the air thick with tension. Barron stood resolutely, his blue eyes locked onto Professor Kingsley, who, for the first time in years, seemed momentarily thrown off balance. The silence stretched on, suffocating. Then Kingsley spoke, his voice tinged with amusement, but betraying a hint of defensiveness. Ah, so we have a believer among us, Kingsley said, his lips curling into a half-smile. Tell me, Barron, what makes you so certain of this depth you speak of? The history books, the scholars, they all tell us the same thing. It's just myth. He let the last word hang in the air, dripping with disdain. Barron's expression remained stoic, but his fists tightened at his sides. "It's not just about what the books say," he replied, his voice firm and unwavering. "It's about what's true. Jesus' teachings are the foundation of something greater than history or myth. You can't just reduce it to a political agenda. Professor, it's deeper than that." A murmur of agreement stirred from the other side of the room, but Barron didn't falter. He wasn't used to backing down, especially when it came to something he believed so strongly in. His father had taught him to stand up for what was right, even when it wasn't popular. And this, right now, felt like one of those moments. But what was supposed to be a simple disagreement quickly escalated, as Kingsley, never one to take criticism lightly, leaned forward, his tone turning sharp. "You're too young to understand the weight of history," Kingsley countered, his words cutting. "You've been fed the same lies, the same false narrative. Just because someone repeats something long enough doesn't make it true. If you're not careful, you'll fall into the same traps your father did." The jab hit harder than Barron had anticipated. His father. That was the one line he hadn't expected to cross. The room grew quieter, more tense, as all eyes turned to Barron, waiting for his response. A flicker of anger passed through Barron's face, but it was quickly replaced with a calm determination. He couldn't let this go unanswered. And now, not like this. "I'm not my father," Barron said, his voice low but steady. "I'm me, and I know what I believe." The immediate consequence was almost palpable. The class had gone from intellectual discussion to something much more personal, much more heated. A few students exchanged looks, some in support, others in disbelief. But Barron wasn't concerned with their reactions. He could feel the pressure mounting, his heart racing. Then, just as quickly as the tension had erupted, Professor Kingsley straightened in his chair, almost amused by Barron's response. "Well then, prove it." The gauntlet had been thrown down. The catalyst for Barron's involvement had begun. And it would lead him down a path where not just his beliefs, but his very identity would be put to the test. But he wasn't alone. Across the room, sitting quietly at the back, was Jenna, a longtime friend of Barron's and someone who had watched this exchange unfold with growing concern. She knew Barron better than anyone and could see the storm brewing within him. She rose from her seat, stepping quietly toward him as the lecture continued. "Barron," Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmurs. "Don't let him get under your skin." Barron gave her a brief nod, but his eyes were distant, already lost in the challenge ahead. He knew Jenna meant well, but this wasn't just about Kingsley. This was about something much deeper, a personal battle for truth, for meaning, and for his place in the world. The moment had arrived. Barron knew there would be no turning back. Barron's mind raced as he left the lecture hall, the sound of Kingsley's mocking laughter still ringing in his ears. Jenna had stayed behind, assuring him she'd catch up, but Barron needed a moment. Alone, the campus was alive with the usual bustle of students, some heading to classes, others gathered in groups discussing the latest trends. But Barron walked with a sense of isolation, as though the world had shifted on its axis. The challenge was now real. And it wasn't just academic, it was personal. He sat down on a bench under a large oak tree, its leaves turning shades of gold and red. He closed his eyes, trying to breathe, but the words from the lecture kept echoing. In his mind, prove it. The command rang in his head, demanding an answer that he wasn't sure he had. Could he truly prove the depth of his beliefs? What did that even mean? He ran a hand through his hair, his mind swirling with doubt. The easy path would be to walk away, to let Kingsley's provocations slide. But something within him, something powerful, something deep, refused to let it go. He knew that Kingsley wasn't just attacking Jesus or religion. He was challenging everything Barron had been raised to believe. Everything his family stood for, But the more Barron thought, the more uncertain he became. He had never been a crusader. His life had been sheltered, removed from the fiery conflicts that had marked his father's public life. Barron was used to being in the background, observing rather than confronting. The idea of standing up, especially in a battle over something as controversial as faith, felt overwhelming. "Hey," a voice broke through his thoughts. Barron looked up to see Jenna standing there, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "You okay?" she asked softly, sitting beside him. Barron stared at the ground, unwilling to meet her gaze. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I have what it takes." Jenna was quiet for a long moment, then gently placed a hand on his arm. "Barron, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." To Kingsley. "Not to anyone. But if this means something to you, you can't back down now. Don't let him win." Barron met her eyes, her sincerity offering a momentary relief from the pressure that had been mounting inside him. But the weight of her words still lingered. He wasn't just battling Kingsley, he was battling himself, questioning his own worth and conviction. Suddenly, the reality of the situation hit him like a cold gust of wind. He had always been the son of a former president, used to the public eye, but this was different. This wasn't about family legacy. This was about Barron, his beliefs, his identity, and if he couldn't stand firm now, who would he be? Just then, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a text from his mother. "I heard about what happened. Don't let anyone shake your faith. You're stronger than they think." The words of reassurance from his mother were comforting, but they only deepened the internal conflict. Barron had been raised to believe in something far more profound than any intellectual argument could counter. Yet the doubt that had started to creep in still lingered. He stood up abruptly, determination beginning to replace his hesitation. "I'm going to prove it, Jenna. I have to." But even as he said the words, a part of him wondered if he was ready for what lay ahead. Was he prepared for the weight of this challenge, the scrutiny, the inevitable pushback from Kingsley and perhaps others who would follow his lead? The path forward was unclear, and Barron couldn't shake the feeling that with every step, the stakes were growing higher. The days that followed the lecture were a blur for Barron. Each moment seemed weighed down by the tension he had created, not just in the classroom, but within himself. His mind was a battlefield, constantly torn between self-doubt and the burning need to prove something to himself, to Kingsley, and to anyone else who questioned the faith he had inherited. Every time he walked past the classroom, he could feel the eyes of his peers on him, some with curiosity, others with skepticism, but none more so than Kingsley, who, for the first time, didn't just view Barron as a student. He viewed him as an opponent. Barron was alone in his dorm room one evening, scrolling through his phone when a new notification popped up on the screen. It was from Jenna, asking him to meet her at the coffee shop on campus. Barron had seen her in the hallways earlier that day, but they hadn't had the chance to talk. He grabbed his jacket and headed out. The cool evening air sharp against his skin. The coffee shop was bustling with students, the scent of roasted beans filling the air. Barron found Jenna sitting by the window, her face etched with a seriousness that caught him off guard. She stood as soon as she saw him. "Barron, you need to see this," Jenna said, handing him her phone. Barron glanced at the screen. It was a video one that had been shared thousands of times. It showed Kingsley in an earlier interview with a prominent news outlet, mocking Barron's beliefs, calling the young man a naive product of privilege, and dismissing his challenge as the misguided attempt of a teenager to prove something he will never understand. The words stung. But it wasn't just the criticism that cut Barron to the core. It was the realization that Kingsley hadn't just viewed the confrontation as a professional debate. He had made Barron the target of a personal attack, something designed to undermine everything he stood for. This wasn't just an academic discussion anymore. It had become a fight for respect, for recognition. Jenna watched him closely, her eyes soft with concern. "Barron, you need to be careful. It's not just about faith anymore. Kingsley has turned this into something bigger. He's trying to make you the punchline, to dismiss you because of who you are, not what you believe." Barron clenched. His fists, his chest tight with anger. He had known that Kingsley would escalate things, but this was more than he'd anticipated. It wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about defending his dignity, his worth. "You're right," Barron said, his voice hardening. "I can't let this go. But I'm not just going to prove it to him, I'm going to show everyone. I'm not backing down." It was in that moment, standing in the warmth of the coffee shop with Jenna, that Barron felt a shift deep within him. He wasn't just the son of a former president or some kid who was trying to win a meaningless argument. He was someone who had his own voice, his own beliefs. He wasn't going to let anyone, not even a professor with a platform, silence him. The turning point had come not just because of Kingsley's attack, but because Barron had finally realized that his journey wasn't about proving others wrong. It was about standing up for the truth he held within, no matter the consequences. The stakes had never been higher. The day of the campus debate arrived, and Barron stood outside the large auditorium, his heart hammering in his chest. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with anticipation. Flyers promoting the event were scattered across the campus, some calling it the showdown of the century, others mocking it as the battle between privilege and faith. The buzz from social media was relentless, with hashtags like #Barron vs Kingsley trending all over. Barron's name had become the subject of conversation for everyone, whether they supported him or ridiculed him. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, more so than ever before. This wasn't just a debate about faith or Jesus, Christ, or religion. This was about identity. It was about the truth he had carried within him, the beliefs he'd held onto for years. But it was also about silencing the growing doubt that had taken root in his mind. Kingsley's sharp words from their first encounter still echoed inside him. "You're too young to understand. You've been fed the same lies your whole life." And yet, Barron felt the old fire burning within him now, stronger than ever. He had been through the motions: his mother's text, Jenna's unwavering support, the endless research and hours spent grappling with Kingsley's arguments. But now, standing on the precipice of this confrontation, Barron knew it wasn't just about showing Kingsley up in front of a crowd. It was about confronting everything he believed to be true, and proving to himself that faith could stand against the most skeptical, most cynical challenges. The auditorium was packed, and Barron could see Kingsley up on the stage already, his smug, self-assured expression the same as it had been in the classroom. His disarming smile was gone, replaced by a cold academic detachment. The professor had a reputation to uphold, and today he was here to not only defeat Barron, but to crush the naive young man in front of an entire audience. As Barron stepped into the room, the crowd's murmurs died down. Every eye in the room was on him, some in curiosity, others in judgment. He walked to the stage, his legs stiff but resolute. He was no longer a son standing in the shadow of his father's legacy. He was Barron Trump, and he was about to face the most difficult trial of his life. The debate began with Kingsley speaking first. His words were smooth, calculated. He spun a narrative of historical inaccuracies and philosophical questioning, painting Jesus as a mere mortal whose influence had been exaggerated. Barron listened, his fists clenched under the table, his mind racing to counter every argument, every accusation. Finally, the moment came for Barron to speak. He stood up, his heart pounding as he looked out at the audience. He took a deep breath, willing his hands to stop shaking. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone except himself. Professor Kingsley. Barron began, his voice steady, but with the quiet intensity that only came from deep conviction. What you've spoken. Today about myth and politics and manipulation, myth is the most important thing. The truth of Jesus' teachings isn't about political agendas or historical constructs. It's about love, about sacrifice, about something bigger than all of us. The audience was silent as Barron continued, his words gaining strength with every sentence. He spoke of Jesus' compassion, his radical forgiveness, and the way his teachings had transcended generations. Not through the power of myth, but through the undeniable force of human connection. Barron spoke from the heart, from a place that no amount of historical revisionism could touch. The belief wasn't in what Jesus had done, but in what he still represented, a beacon of hope, of love that shone through even the darkest times. His voice began to rise, carrying the weight of everything he had been holding in. What Kingsley refuses to understand is that faith doesn't need to be scientifically proven or historically validated to be real. It lives in the hearts of those who believe, and it changes lives. It has the power to heal, to guide, to inspire. That's the truth. And it's why I stand here today. Barron finished. And for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the applause began. It started softly, hesitant, but soon grew louder, filling the auditorium. Barron felt a wave of relief flood through him, a sense of pride and clarity he hadn't realized he'd been missing. But even as the crowd cheered, Barron locked eyes with Kingsley. The professor's face was unreadable, but Barron could see the faintest twitch of annoyance. The sting of having been publicly challenged in a way he hadn't anticipated. The battle had been fought, the words exchanged, but Barron realized it wasn't about winning. It was about standing up, confronting his beliefs, and finding his own voice in the process. As the applause swelled, Barron felt something shift inside him. A final, irrevocable shift. The man he was becoming wasn't defined by his family, his legacy, or even by Kingsley's challenges. It was defined by the truth he carried and the courage to stand firm in it. No matter the consequences, as Barron descended from the stage, his heart still racing with the adrenaline of the debate, he felt a strange mix of relief and accomplishment. The auditorium was buzzing with excitement. The audience still discussing the points he'd raised, the powerful message he'd conveyed. Jenna was already waiting for him outside the doors, her face breaking into a wide smile as she saw him. "Approach. You did it," she said, her voice warm with pride. Barron gave a small, tired smile, but it was the first time in days that he felt the weight of everything's doubt, his uncertainty, and the challenge he had faced finally lifting. "I don't know if I did it," he said, exhaling slowly, "but I did what I had to do." "For me," Jenna nodded, squeezing his arm. "That's all that matters. You found your voice out there. That's what people will remember." As they walked out into the crisp evening air, Barron found himself reflecting on the journey he'd just taken. This wasn't about winning, or losing in the conventional sense. It wasn't about silencing Kingsley or proving anyone wrong. It had never been about proving anything to the crowd or his critics. The true victory had been in his own transformation, in how he had stepped into his beliefs with clarity and strength. Despite the pressures and challenges that had threatened to drown him, the road to this point hadn't been easy. The uncertainty, the moments of self-doubt, the temptation to back away from the conflict, had all been part of the process. But Barron had learned something crucial. Faith, real faith, wasn't about blind certainty or unshakable answers. It was about the courage to ask questions, to seek truth, and to stand firm in what you believed, even when the world around you questioned your every move. Back in his dorm later that night, Barron sat by his desk, reflecting on the debate. didn't know what the future held or how things would change moving forward. But one thing was clear: he had found his own path. He had stepped out from the shadows, no longer defined by the expectations of his family, his peers, or his critics. The journey wasn't over. But for the first time in a long while, Barron felt ready for whatever came next. And in that quiet moment, he realized that sometimes the greatest victory wasn't in the battle itself, but in the courage to face it, and in the strength to believe, no matter the cost. Faith, when tested, becomes more than belief, becomes a part of you.